On a storm-dark night in the winter of 1831, a fire broke out in the grand estate of the Van Alder family of Virginia. As the townspeople rushed to contain the flames, they swore they saw something more disturbing than smoke or fire. Two women, silhouetted against the burning windows, clutching infants in their arms. One was the Countess Eliza Van Alder, wrapped in velvet. The other, a woman enslaved on the property, half naked, streaked with ash and blood. Witnesses said the two women did not run, did not scream. They simply exchanged the babies. And then, as if bound by some unholy ritual, both women vanished into the inferno. No bodies were recovered. Only the cries of two infants remained. One would inherit the Van Alder dynasty. The other would disappear into the labyrinth of America's hidden underclass. But the truth was far darker. For in that exchange, something unnatural was set loose. Generations later, the Van Alder name would rot under whispers of insanity, incest, and unexplained deaths. The dynasty collapsed, and the ruins of their estate became a forbidden sight, where even children dared not play. What happened that night in 1831? This is not a tale of fire and inheritance. It is a story of a pact, one whispered through sermons, orphanages, and the dark corridors of Southern society. A pact born of corruption and suffering, of bloodlines deliberately defiled. As we peel back the layers of this forgotten horror, you will understand why the Van Alder dynasty could not survive, and why some secrets, buried in American soil, should never be unearthed. Before the fire, before the whispers of curses and madness, the Van Alder name commanded all across Virginia's plantation belt. Their dynasty traced its roots to Dutch merchants who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1700s, bringing with them the wealth of old-world trade. By 1830, the Van Alders controlled thousands of acres of tobacco fields, dozens of enslaved families, and political clout that reached the state legislature. Their mansion, a sprawling Georgian estate with tall white columns, was a symbol of their supremacy, a beacon of aristocracy in a land still bleeding from revolution. To the townsfolk, the Van Alders seemed untouchable. Their church pew sat in the very front row. Their portraits hung in the courthouse. Their name was inked into deeds and contracts that stretched across counties. But behind the polished veneer, the family carried a quiet desperation. The dynasty's wealth was bound to the soil, but the soil was poisoned with suffering. Generations of enslaved men and women had lived and died breaking their backs in Van Alder fields. Mothers saw children torn from their arms, fathers chained and sold, prayers drowned out by the crack of whips. That grief lingered in the air of the estate like smoke, unseen, unacknowledged, but never gone. It was into this house of contradictions that Countess Eliza married, a woman of European refinement. She brought silk, lace, and foreign perfumes to a land caked in blood. And though she dined with senators and hosted grand balls, she could not hide the truth whispered behind her back. Her womb had failed her. The dynasty's survival demanded an heir, and with every miscarriage, every stillborn child, Eliza's desperation grew sharper. By 1831, the Van Alder name glittered in public. But in the chambers of their mansion, the dynasty's foundation was already rotting. Eliza Van Alder was remembered in faded portraits as pale, elegant, and unyieldingly poised. Her skin carried the porcelain sheen of European nobility. Her dark hair wound in elaborate coils, her gaze sharpened by an intensity that unsettled even her admirers. She arrived in Virginia not as a fragile bride, but as a woman whose presence dominated rooms. People whispered she had the carriage of a queen and the coldness of one, too. But beneath the composure was a woman hollowed out by grief. Her journals, few that survived, speak of sleepless nights, blood-soaked linens, and a silence in her chambers that even a flicker of candlelight could not soften. Eliza miscarried 3 children within the first 5 years of her marriage, each lost deep in the fissure between her body and her destiny. To be Countess Van Alder meant producing an heir, Without one, she was a decorative ruin draped in silk. Her desperation bred secrecy. Servants whispered of strange rituals in her rooms. Bowls of milk left by windows, bones buried beneath the hearth, scraps of fabric scorched in hidden fires. Eliza, they said, had begun to look for answers not in scripture, but in shadows. By 1831, her body was exhausted and her soul gnawed by failure. Yet her obsession grew feverish. She believed her lineage could be salvaged as she reached beyond the boundaries of her station, beyond even the laws of flesh and blood. It was then that her eyes turned toward the quarters where the enslaved women lived. There, among mothers who had been forced to birth child after child for the market, was a vitality she lacked. And within one woman in particular, a young mother whispered to have roots in African spiritual lineages. Eliza saw not just envy, but opportunity. The pact had not yet been spoken, but in Eliza's mind, the thought had already taken root. Her name, if ever recorded, was erased from the ledgers of the Van Alder estate. In plantation books, she appears only as a number, an age, and a notation of female fertile. But among the quarters, she was known as Mariah, though some claimed her true name was older, carried from the western coast of Africa, a name the overseers could not pronounce and refused to keep alive. Mariah bore quiet resilience that unsettled her captors. Unlike many, she had managed to keep one of her children with her, an infant boy not yet sold or claimed by traders. She rocked him at night with lullabies whispered in a language foreign to Virginia's ears, words that carried the cadence of prayers and warnings. Elders in the quarters murmured that her grandmother had been a midwife, a healer who carried fragments of traditions banned by both law and church. The Countess watched her from a distance. To Eliza, Mariah was both threat and vessel. She resented the woman's ability to bring forth life while her own body betrayed her, yet she saw in her child something she might possess, something she could twist into salvation for the Van Alder name. Mariah lived under constant threat. Rumors spread of her being whipped for speaking out, of her being forced to kneel in the churchyard for an entire day as punishment for defiance. Yet she never bowed entirely. Witnesses later claimed she would fix her eyes on the mansion as though she could see straight through its brick walls, as though she knew its foundations were already sinking. When Eliza approached her with the first whisper of the bargain, Mariah did not scream. She did not weep. She simply listened, her face unreadable, her grip tightening on her son's small body. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any refusal. No one knows the exact words spoken between Eliza Van Alder and Mariah in those shadowed nights of 1831. No record survives. No parchment bears a mark of their agreement. But fragments of testimony, whispered through generations, suggest that the bargain was struck not in writing, but in flesh. Eliza, desperate to preserve her dynasty, offered something unspeakable, the exchange of children. Her miscarried womb had left her barren of heirs, yet her title demanded lineage. Mariah, holding her son with fierce devotion, faced the crushing certainty that the child would one day be torn from her arms and sold to strangers. The terms, as remembered in folklore, were simple and terrible. Eliza would claim Mariah's child as her own heir, securing him wealth and status under the Van Alder name. In return, Eliza promised protection for Mariah's infant daughter, a girl rumored to be born the same week as the stillborn Van Alder child. The Countess swore she would raise the girl in secret, hidden from the slave traders' ledgers, safe from the brutality of the auction block. But there was something darker beneath the surface. Witnesses claimed the women met not in the mansion, but in the broken chapel at the edge of the state grounds. Candles guttered against the damp stone, and scraps of scripture lay scattered like dead leaves. Some say the two mothers knelt before the altar not to God, but to a shadow neither dared name. Fire was lit. Symbols were marked and stood upon the floor in blood, whether from hand or womb, sealed what neither woman could ever undo. The pact was not a transaction. It was a transgression, a crossing of lines drawn by law, blood, and faith. And when dawn came, the fate of two families, one exalted, one enslaved, had been bound together in silence. The night of February 1831 was thick with wind and storm, a night when the sky itself seemed to conspire with human sin. The Van Alder estate, proud and gleaming in daylight, became a fortress of shadows as thunder cracked and rain turned the fields to mud. But in the mansion's upper rooms, a different fire was already smoldering, one not of weather, but of will. Witnesses would later speak of a glow at the windows long before the flames reached the roof. Servants saw Eliza Van Alder carrying a swaddled infant through the halls, her gown dragging like a funeral shroud. Marrow was seen at her side, barefoot, her eyes blackened with ash. Together they entered the nursery, and moments later, smoke began to seep beneath the door. The fire erupted as though the house itself had exhaled centuries of withheld anguish. Curtains ignited, beams cracked, and portraits of the Dynasty shriveled into curls of charred townsfolk rushed into the estate, swore they saw the impossible. Two women framed in the windows, each holding a child, not fleeing, not begging for help, but standing still as if performing a rite. And then, in that unholy tableau, the exchange, a silent handover, flesh for flesh, life for life. When rescuers burst into the ruins, they found only the cries of infants. One was wrapped in velvet, marked with a Van Alder crest. The other lay in coarse linen, streaked with soot. The women were gone, not burned bodies, not bones, nothing. The townspeople whispered of fire too hot, too swift, as if it had been summoned, not sparked. Some said the flames consumed more than timber, that they devoured truth itself. From that night forward, no one would ever know which child carried Van Alder blood and which carried the blood of bondage. In the ashes of the Van Alder mansion, 2 infants survived, yet their paths were set upon a cruel divergence. The first child, dressed in the velvet of aristocracy, was immediately proclaimed the long-awaited heir to the dynasty. His cries were carried into the church as proof that the Van Alders had triumphed over tragedy. Priests blessed him, neighbors congratulated the family, and the boy was christened under the Van Alder name with silver and scripture. The second child, swaddled in coarse linen and smoke-stained cloth, was spirited away under cover of silence. Some said he was sent to the orphanage in Richmond. Others swore he was handed over to distant relatives of enslaved quarters. Records vanished, names altered, and soon no one in town dared to speak of the other baby. For to admit his existence was to admit the exchange, that aristocracy might be built upon a lie. As the years unfolded, the heir of the dynasty grew amid chandeliers and tutors, his every breath recorded as though he carried the destiny of a nation. Yet servants whispered of violent outbursts, of nights when the child screamed in a tongue none could understand, his eyes rolling as if he remembered something from a place older than himself. Meanwhile, the lost child grew nameless. His life was carved by scarcity and silence. Raised without history, he carried a wound deeper than poverty, the wound of stolen identity. Those who encountered him described a boy with eyes like mirrors, reflecting the gaze of anyone who dared look too long, as though he was searching for the face he was meant to have. 2 infants, 2 destinies, one cloaked in wealth, the other in shadow, yet bound by the same night, the same pact, the same fire. And as both grew, their lives would spiral toward the same abyss. The church was supposed to be the keeper of truth in the Van Alder parish. Its bells tolled over every birth, marriage, and death. Its ledgers served as the spine of community memory. Yet in 1831, the church became the first conspirator in silencing what had happened. When the priest baptized the surviving Van Alder heir, parishioners noted his hesitation. His hands trembled as he held the child over the basin. Some said the water turned cloudy, as though ash had followed the infant even into the font. Still, the baptism was recorded cleanly. The son of Countess Eliza and Lord Van Alder, rightful heir to the estate. But what of the other child? Here the records go blank. In a year when 2 infants should have been noted, only 1 entry exists. Parish books were scrubbed, pages torn out, births rearranged in ink. It was as if one soul had been excised from memory, and yet the whispers spread. Servants confided to one another in hushed tones about the second child. Women at the market muttered that the Countess had been seen walking with 2 infants that night, not 1. Children dare each other to run past the churchyard, claiming that if you listened by the old oak tree at dusk, you could hear 2 babies crying in the wind, one soft, one shrill. Behind closed doors, clergy debated the danger. If the truth were revealed, it would not only ruin the Van Alder name, but also taint the authority of the church itself, which had sanctified a fraud. So silence became scripture. The truth was buried beneath sermons on obedience and sacrifice. The church bells continued to toll, but their sound was hollow. For in that parish, faith had been shackled to a lie, and the lie rang louder than prayer. If the dynasty's heir was gilded in silk and scripture, the other child was swallowed by silence. The orphanage in Richmond, where rumor places him, was no sanctuary. In the early 19th century, such institutions were warehouses for the unwanted, places where children were stripped of lineage, renamed, and broken into obedience. Records from 1831 show an unnamed infant delivered to St. Bridget's Asylum for Forsaken. His file carries no parentage, no baptismal certificate, only a scrawled note, asterisk, foundling, taken in during storm. Asterisk, it is likely this was a child exchanged in fire, deposited where he would be raised without family, without claim, without proof of who he was. Life inside St. Bridget's was a litany of suffering. Children slept in iron cots, rows of pale faces staring at ceilings darkened with mildew. Meals were little more than broth and bread crusts. Discipline was merciless. Missteps punished with a rod. Silence demanded even from infants. Yet what haunted the halls most was the absence of names. Boys were called by numbers, their surnames stripped away, leaving them like ghosts in flesh. The child who should have borne the Van Alder crest was numbered 27. Witnesses decades later recalled a boy unlike the others, his eyes startlingly bright, his presence unsettling to both children and matrons. Some said the boy never cried. Others swore they heard him whisper at night in a language none could place, as though the fire itself had taught him to speak. By the age of 6, he vanished from St. Bridget's records. Some claimed he was apprenticed to a tradesman. Others whispered he was sold quietly into labor. Yet those who worked at the asylum remembered him with unease. One matron confessed in her final years that the child had told her something she could never repeat, that he knew he was not who they claimed, that his name had been stolen in fire. And with that disappearance, the orphanage swallowed its secret whole. In the years after the fire, the Van Alder family seemed untouched by tragedy. Their rebuilt mansion rose higher than before, its columns gleaming white against the Virginian sun, as if daring the world to question their resilience. Tobacco profits swelled, political favors deepened, and the dynasty's new heir, presented as a miraculous child who survived the flames, became the centerpiece of their triumph. Society praised the Van Alders as chosen by Providence. Ministers spoke of divine protection, spinning sermons about how God had preserved their line through trial by fire. At county gatherings, neighbors whispered admiration, their envy tucked behind polite smiles. The Van Alders hosted grand balls, where the chandeliers glittered and violins sang over floors polished to a mirror sheen. In every room, the heir's portrait hung, an infant painted in angelic whites, a symbol of continuity and strength. Yet prosperity was not peace. Servants in the mansion spoke of restless nights, when the child's screams rattled through the corridors, piercing enough to startle horses in their stalls. Tutors complained of sudden rages, moments when the boy's composure shattered and he became unrecognizable, his voice dropping into guttural tones, his eyes glazed as though another presence stared through him. Still, the Van Alders silenced these rumors with their wealth. No priest dared question the baptism. No neighbor pressed too hard on the gaps in the family ledger. Money erased suspicion, and reputation smothered truth. The dynasty flourished outwardly, like a tree heavy with fruit, but its roots had been poisoned. The pact made in fire had not disappeared. It had only woven itself deeper into the bloodline, invisible yet inescapable. For in every banquet toast, in every polished gesture of power, there lingered the unseen shadow of the second child, the missing twin of fate whose silence echoed louder with each passing year. By the time the Van Alder heir reached adolescence, the cracks in the dynasty could no longer be hidden behind chandeliers and Sunday sermons. Madness had crept into mansion, slow at first, then with relentless force, until it seemed every hallway echoed with whispers not spoken by human tongues. The boy, celebrated as the future of the family, became a source of dread for those closest to him. Servants told of finding him standing motionless in the nursery long after midnight, staring into an empty cradle as though waiting for something to stir. Tutors described lessons that dissolved into violence, ink splattered like blood across the page, quills snapped in clenched fists, words muttered in voices that sounded too old for a child. Animals recoiled from him. Horses bucked when he drew near. Dogs whimpered and slunk to the corners of the room. Even infants of visiting guests wailed when placed in his presence, their cries shrill and unyielding until he was taken away. The family, terrified of scandal, confined his episodes to the shadows of the state. Physicians were summoned in secret. Some declared it a nervous affliction. Others whispered of inherited weakness in the bloodline. But none could explain away the boy's dreams bled into waking life. Visions of fire, of women exchanging children, of a name he should not have known. By his 17th year, he had begun to carve symbols into the wood of the mansion, strange markings no one recognized. When confronted, he claimed he was only tracing what he saw on the walls at night, patterns that burned when he closed his eyes. The Van Alders kept hosting their grand dinners, their political gatherings, their displays of prosperity. Yet, within their own home, madness had taken root. And it was not the madness of one child. It was the echo of a pact still binding the blood that flowed in their veins. For decades, the official history of the Van Alder dynasty remained pristine. Parish books declared the heir legitimate. Court ledgers recorded the estate intact, and newspapers praised the family's philanthropy. But beneath the polished ink lay gaps, gaping silences that revealed the machinery of suppression. Archivists in the late 19th century uncovered parish records with entire pages torn out, pages that would have marked baptisms in early 1831. In the county courthouse, birth certificates for enslaved children of that year were missing, replaced by blank entries and smudged ink. Even private correspondence from local clergy bore signs of deliberate excision. Letters abruptly cut mid-sentence, fragments scorched along their edges, as if someone fed them a fire and then pulled them back too late. The most chilling discovery came from an estate ledger hidden in a locked drawer of the mansion's ruined library. On one page, the name Mariah appeared beside a notation child kept. The next entry, written in a different hand, struck through her name with heavy ink. No record of her or her children appeared again. It was as though they had been unmade. Scholars who pieced together these fragments began to suspect that the Van Alders were not alone in their silence. The church, the courts, even local newspapers seemed to participate in a conspiracy of erasure. To acknowledge the possibility of a child exchange between mistress and enslaved was to unravel not only a dynasty, but the entire system that upheld it. Thus, silence became preservation. The dynasty was allowed to endure, but only by burying truth alive. The result was not the protection of legacy, but its slow infection. For what is erased does not vanish. It festers. And in the Van Alder family, the rot of unspoken history began to seep through generations, staining every document, every portrait, every whispered name. While the Van Alders thrived in public splendor, the silenced lineage of the other child unraveled in shadows. The boy once numbered 27 at St. Bridget's orphanage did not vanish entirely. He reemerged, scattered across fragments of records and rumors, a life mapped only through absence and suffering. By the 1840s, a man bearing no family name appeared on prison rolls in Richmond, sentenced for vagrancy. Descriptions matched the lost child, unusually tall with sharp, unsettling eyes and a scar along his wrist that he claimed he had carried since infancy. Witnesses described his strange charisma, how he could quiet a room simply by looking into it, how he seemed to know things about people that they had never spoken aloud. He drifted between labor camps, prisons, and boarding houses, leaving no trace of kin, no rooted identity. His descendants, too, carried the spectral weight. Families who later traced their bloodlines through his children found a legacy not of land or name, but of dislocation. Generations were marked by premature deaths, unexplained fevers, men disappearing into wars or prisons, women vanishing after childbirth. What survived was not stability, but restlessness, a constant sense of being haunted by something stolen. Oral traditions preserved by his grandchildren told of a curse, of a child exchanged, of fire, of a family name they were forbidden to speak. Some elders claimed the man himself confessed in old age that he was born of 2 mothers and none, that his life had been carved out of a pact no one could break. Thus, while the Van Alders paraded their heir beneath chandeliers, the other line drifted through America's hidden underclass, haunted, dispossessed, carrying an invisible inheritance of silence. And as the decades turned, the 2 lineages, one gilded, one erased, continued to mirror each other, bound by the same night in 1831, their destinies circling ever closer toward collapse. By the time the Countess died in 1863, her name had nearly disappeared from the ledgers of polite society, not because she had been forgotten, but because she had been systematically erased. The families who had once entertained her at banquets now refused to speak her name. The church that baptized her grandchildren struck her from its records, the priest's handwriting deliberately smudged as though ash had been dragged across the page. She had become what some whispered was a living omission, but the silence was not accidental. It was doctrine. Hidden among the sermons of Reverend Silas Boone, the minister who presided over St. Matthew's Church in Fairmount, was a set of private writings called the Doctrine of Silence. These pages, later found buried behind plaster in the rectory wall, laid out a chilling instruction. That which enters by corruption must be contained in silence. Only silence preserved the walls from collapse. Speak nothing, and the rot will remain unseen. Boone's words suggest that the town itself had reached an agreement, not unlike the Countess's Pact, to bury the memory of what had happened in 1831. Babies exchanged, bloodlines muddled, a dynasty collapsed from within. But worse, an infection of secrecy had spread beyond one family, taking root in the very institutions designed to preserve truth. The church became an accomplice, the courthouse a vault of selective memory, the schoolhouse a training ground for obedient silence. The children of the exchanged bloodlines were now adults, and though their lives had diverged, Their shadows stretched back to the same moment of betrayal. Some carried wealth and names that were not theirs. Others bore scars of poverty that should never have touched them, yet they moved through the world unaware, their destinies carrying the mark of a curse that had been carefully concealed. Fairmount learned to live with the silence, but silence is never empty. It hums. It grows heavy. It presses on the lungs of those forced to hold it. And eventually, silence becomes the loudest voice of all. For decades, the silence held. The town grew. Rail lines stitched new commerce into its soil, and Fairmount appeared to the outside world as orderly, prosperous, unremarkable. But beneath the polished veneer, a hairline crack began to spread. It started with names. A clerk in the courthouse, tasked with updating property transfers in 1891, noticed that one deed contained two signatures from the same man, 30 years apart, yet identical in their hesitation and flourish. The man should have been dead long before the second signature. When the clerk brought this to the judge, he was told, "File it, say nothing." And so he did, but he kept the copy. Then came the births. The town's midwives, often more honest record-keepers than any priest, began whispering about strange patterns. Babies born to mothers who could not explain their bloodlines, children who resembled neighbors more than fathers. The stories always ended the same way. The families moved away or were swallowed into the church's registry, names blotted out, lineage blurred. But it was the orphans who cracked the silence wide open. By the turn of the century, the Fairmount orphanage had grown swollen, housing more children than any town its size should reasonably support. Many were left with no histories, no baptismal papers, only initials sewn into their clothes. When a teacher pressed for answers, asking how so many nameless children appeared, she was dismissed. Days later, she vanished herself. Her rented room emptied in the night as though she had never lived there. The silence was no longer protective. It was predatory, feeding on those who questioned it. Every attempt to name the rot beneath Fairmount was swallowed, erased, or made to disappear. And yet, in this very erasure, the pattern revealed itself. The Pact of 1831 was not forgotten. It was alive, maintained by force, pulsing through the veins of every institution built to contain it. What Elias Harrow uncovered did not vanish with him. A fragment of his notes, smuggled out by a sympathetic servant at the orphanage, survived, just a handful of pages, brittle and singed as though someone had tried to burn them. They told of a deeper horror than any mere exchange of infants. According to Harrow's annotations, the Countess had not invented the Pact in 1831. She had inherited it. The practice of child exchange, of obscuring bloodlines, stretched back to Europe, to whispered covenants between lords and serfs, between monasteries and their wards. It was never merely about property or inheritance. It was about containment. Certain bloodlines, Harrow suggested, carried something older than human memory, a corruption, a fracture in the spirit that had to be diluted, dispersed, hidden. The Pact was not just a social deception. It was a ritual of control designed to prevent the concentration of something unspeakable in one line of descent. Fairmount, then, was not a town but a crucible. The orphanage was its engine. Families were its vessels. The church its shield. All complicit in scattering and rescattering bloodlines, so that no one person, no one family, could awaken what the Countess had feared in her own womb. The dynasty she destroyed was not her own, but the world's defense against a resurgence of something ancient and uncontainable. Yet the silence broke down in whispers. By the mid-20th century, strangers spoke of odd children in Fairmount who carried the same eyes, the same marks, though born to unrelated homes. A birthright too carefully sown was now flowering again. The Countess had tried to dilute it. Boone had tried to bury it. Harrow tried to name it. But some truths resist erasure, and as the silence cracks, the question grows louder, what was truly being hidden? And more chilling still, what happens when it can no longer be contained